Alice Pung is the only person that I can pick up and whirly-twirly without kind of doing my back in. But I'm not going to do it tonight because I have a sense of the moment. Her father's daughter tells the story of Alice and her father, a survivor of Cambodia's killing fields. And of course, when Alice was last at Rotunda, her dad and her mum were all there too. And so I feel I know the Pung family a little bit. Alice's first best-selling memoir, Unpolished Gem, was published to critical acclaim in 2006 and has since become a favourite with readers around the world. Amy Tan, author of the Joy Luck Club, says of it, Alice Pung is a gem. I think she got that line from me. Her voice is the real thing. Alice, of course, is also editor of the book Growing Up Asian in Australia, and I'm going to do a book called Growing Up Short in Australia, but I'm not sure if it'll sell all that well. Alice Pung, as I said, was on the very first panel at Rotunda. She's been back many times. I think the last time she was back with Arnold Zabel, and Arnold is a real hero of hers, and they interviewed each other. Could you please welcome to the stage the polished gem herself, Alice Pung.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Bruno, for inviting me once again back to the West, where it all started for me, where my love of writing and reading came about. So I grew up, as some of you might know from my books, in two suburbs, Braybrook and Footscray, and I speak to a lot of secondary schools, and high school kids between the ages of 14 to 17 will never write about themselves. They'll write about vampires, they'll write about gangs in New York, and they'll write about taking drugs. They never write about themselves because they say, we don't have anything interesting to write about, miss. We grew up in two neighbourhoods. And when I was young and growing up in two neighbourhoods, I felt exactly as they did. When I was young, my mum's literature came in the mailbox. It came almost every day. At number 5 Joy Street in Braybrook, this was a little concrete house which my father looked in the Herald Sun one day and said, hey, Paul Keating's old house in the western suburbs of Sydney looks exactly like our house in Braybrook. So he was very proud to be living in his commission house. My mum was very happy every morning when she got her literature delivered, and the literature she read were the Safeway, the Bilo, the Coles, the Target and the Kmart ads, because my mother, she couldn't read and write very well in her first language. They closed down the Chinese schools in Cambodia when she was only in grade 2. So when she came to Australia, she was 8 months pregnant with me, and she had 3 other kids, so there are 4 of us. So every afternoon she would look through the Safeway and Bilo ads, and this was our way of reading the world, because in addition to that, besides the school readers that we got home every evening, we had 2 books in the house. One we got for free, and one my father bought for me when I was about 8. So the one we got for free was the book of dangerous animals in Australia, and it was we still have that. I know all the dangerous snakes and spiders in Australia. And the one that my father got for me was the Reader's Digest book of household hints and handy tips, published in 1988. And it had wonderful hints in there about how to carve a whale out of a watermelon and how to remove grass stains out of white trousers. And so these were the 2 pieces of literature that were constant in my childhood. And my father, though he had lofty aspirations, he named me Alice after Lewis Carroll's creation, Alice in Wonderland, because after surviving the killing fields in Cambodia, he thought that Australia was a wonderland, and people in Australia at the Midway Migrant Hostel were very generous and kind. So I'm named Alice after Lewis Carroll's Alice. And in the 1990s, and I know there's Linda from the library here, the library changed my life. It taught me to read the world in a very different way. When the Footscray Library opened in the 1990s, that was entirely and completely an Asian kid's social and dating life. So your parents, who would own the local grocery store or the Retrovision store in my father's case, or the takeaway shop, would say, go to the library, because the library was safe, it was well lit, it was clean, and Asian kids and books. So we'd go to the library, but we wouldn't be reading. We would be checking out the other kids who were sequestered in a library as well. So that formed my childhood. When I was 18 and I went to university, suddenly the world became much larger, and I studied subjects at university like political science and creative writing. And suddenly I realised that I could write about the West. And the reason I realised this was at university I sat down one afternoon, a lecturer took us out for coffee, and I realised a cup of coffee was $3.20 back then, and I'd never had a $3.20 cup of coffee. I thought it was outrageous when you could buy a whole tin of Nescafe at the Footscray Coles for $3.20. So it was a big culture shock. And then I realised this little microcosm I grew up in, this world called Footscray, this suburb called Braybrook, where we lived behind the carpet factories, was an entirely different world to Melbourne Law School. And so every holidays, while friends were getting clerkships at, Minter Allison's or Allen's Arthur Robinson law firms, my father would say, I'll give you some experience. You come and work at Retrovision. You come and look at our contracts. You help your auntie with her letter to the council about the trees growing in her backyard. And so that was my legal experience. I sold mobile phones at Retrovision. Now, back in the 90s, the late 90s, a mobile phone would take at least half an hour to connect. And we didn't want to lose customers to the local Optus store. So I would have to sit a customer down and say, can I make you a cup of Nescafe? And so I'd go around the back kitchen, mix up some Nescafe with sweetened condensed milk, and talk to the person who was connecting up their mobile phone. And that's how I learnt about the stories in the West. I grew up in this very strange shop where you could watch 20 televisions at the same time, where there used to be a gentleman who used to come in a wheelchair with a bit of tiger skin furry thing wrapped around him, and he used to buy speaker wire, 20 metres at the time, and we used to call him the speaker wire Tarzan. And there used to be another fellow from the funeral parlour who used to come in, and he used to buy 20 VHS tapes, and whole boxes of them at the same time. So we called him the funeral director taper. And these interesting characters in the West suddenly made it into these fictional stories I started writing at university, and people said, where do you come up with all these stories? And so I started to write about the West, and my mother recently was in the Footscray market, and she was haggling over 5 or 10 cents. This is the sort of world that I grew up in, and this is the sort of world that I go back to when I go back and visit my parents. And so one of my favourite poets, Professor Robert Cording from Holy Cross University in the States, said this about writing poetry. He said the poem doesn't or will not work if it feels like it has sifted and rearranged preconceived ideas. It has to feel as if it comes from a real human being, grappling with real human emotions and struggles, with no easy or immediate pithy resolution, but yet is not without some sense of meaning. And so these stories in the West that I wrote about, I also was very lucky that I knew nothing about high literature and I knew nothing about the Australian writing scene. I would send them to Women's Weekly. My pinnacle of success was Reader's Digest. I also sent them to some literary journals that my creative writing instructor told me to send them to, and eventually some of them started to get published, not in this pinnacle of great literature called the Reader's Digest, which I really wanted them to be in, but in a journal called Meanjin. And that's when the editor of Black Ink discovered me. He read one of my stories and said, this is an interesting voice. Never heard that voice before. And so when my books are in high schools, some of them are, I feel so proud. I feel so, proud that the West is being studied as a sense of identity and belonging. When I go back to Footscray City Secondary College, even Springvale High School or Maribyrnong Secondary College, I realise that whole generations of kids who might feel displaced, and Braybrook was not the most positive place to grow up in the 1980s and 90s, during the worst recession, during a period of great upheaval, during the dislocation of technical colleges right next to our schools. And so the last school visits I did was Antonine College, which was a Lebanese school, and before that Ballarat, and then St Monica's in Eppings, and 4 girls' schools in Tasmania. And this is such a change from the first piece of literature or writing, not literature, but writing, that we ever studied about identity and belonging when I was in year 12 in 1997 or 98. We studied this maiden speech from an author and a politician before she was on Dancing with the Stars, Pauline Hanson. She said, they have their own culture and religion, they form ghettos and they don't assimilate. Now, writing Unpolished Gem, starting the very first story as a 19-year-old, the very first sentence, "This story does not begin on a boat," I had no idea that what I was writing was political, whether it was a slice of sense of community that no one had ever seen before, or whether it was an account of social and class hierarchies. It was just a story about growing up in Footscray. But looking back now, I'm so proud. I realise Unpolished Gem is set in a sort of ghetto that Pauline Hanson talks about, the ghetto of Footscray. And it is about a family with its own culture and religion trying to assimilate. At 19, I didn't fully understand the wider political context of my stories. In the 1990s, no one ever came to Footscray unless they had good reasons. Even in 2006, people who had read my book were emailing me and Facebooking me asking, you've opened my eyes to Footscray, I'd like to pay a visit there. Should I take a bum bag or a backpack in case someone snatches my bag from me? And now, wonderful things are happening. Epicure will profile Footscray Market. I led Hanny Rayson around Footscray for a wonderful afternoon. And people are moving to the west. It's the fastest growing demographic. And this is the most interesting thing, is that the most valuable pieces of real estate in Melbourne, Fitzroy, Carlton, Brunswick, Footscray, Yarraville, Richmond, are the places that used to be these ethnic ghettos Pauline Hanson really wanted eradicated. And I realised that I'm not only telling a story about being in the ghetto. These are human stories, and they're populated with human characters, not stories based on overriding themes or plots. And so, for me, learning about identity and place, and about politics and about class, has come as a result of writing. Thank you.
Tonight's Rotunda was so wonderful, and I'd like to thank Bruno for all his efforts in making it happen. Thanks.